Michael Thompson woke up every day at 7:30 a.m., not to an alarm clock, but to the familiar sound of the electric coffee maker his mother, Dorothy, had faithfully turned on for the past 20 years. At 38 years old, he had never slept in a bed other than the one he had as a teenager, on the second floor of the Colonial House on Maple Street, Ohio. The house was a living museum of the 1980s. Floral wallpaper, dark wooden furniture, and photographs of Michael at every stage of life, except one stage that never happened: independence. Dorothy had preserved every corner of that house as a sanctuary for the son who, according to her, preferred the safety of home. Carl Jung would say that Michael was living what he called the pure eternus, the eternal boy who can never grow up. But there was something darker at play. Dorothy wasn't just an overprotective mother. She was an emotional architect who had built a prison disguised as love. In that room Michael drew. It was his only escape valve, creating worlds on paper that he could never inhabit in reality. His drawings showed distant places, people walking freely, infinite horizons. It was as if his soul cried out for freedom through his pencil. "Why don't you ever go out, Michael?" asked the few acquaintances he still had. He always replied, "My mother needs me." But the truth he couldn't see was that he had become Dorothy's reason for existing, and she, unconsciously, had sabotaged any chance for him to discover who he truly was. Jung spoke of the shadow, that part of ourselves we deny and repress. Michael had a massive shadow, and it began to whisper louder when he turned 38. It was as if something inside him was desperate to emerge. One morning, while organizing some old papers for Dorothy, Michael found a pile of letters addressed to him that he had never seen before. They were yellowed with postmarks from 1998, 1999, 2000. His heart raced. Among them, one that would change everything. "Congratulations. You have been selected for our art exchange program in Florence, Italy." Michael read and reread the letter. It was from an art scholarship he had secretly applied to at 18, a timid attempt to imagine a different life. But he had never received this letter. In fact, he had never received any of the replies. "Mom," he went downstairs, hands trembling. "What are these letters?" Dorothy looked and her face went pale. For a moment, the mask of the devoted mother slipped, and Michael saw something he had never noticed before. Fear. Pure fear of being abandoned. "Michael, sweetheart, those letters. They were about things that would only hurt you. The world out there is cruel. I was only trying to protect you." But Michael was beginning to see. For the first time in his life, the fog was lifting, and he was seeing the architecture of his prison. Jung described the anima as the repressed feminine part of the male psyche, the source of creativity, passion, and deep emotional connection. Michael had suppressed his anima for decades, but now it was resurfacing with full force. That night, he couldn't sleep. He looked out his bedroom window and for the first time truly saw the world outside. Families walking, couples holding hands, children running freely. He felt a pain in his chest so intense he doubled over. "I could have had a life," he thought as tears rolled down his face. "I could have known love, traveled, created, lived." He began researching the exchange program online. He discovered that many of his high school classmates had participated in similar programs, built careers, families, full lives. And him? He had become a ghost in his own existence. Dorothy sensed the change. She became more anxious, more controlling. "Michael, you seem off. Are you feeling okay? Maybe we should see a doctor." Always the same tactic, turning any sign of independence into a health problem. But something had changed in Michael, something irreversible. For the first time, he was questioning the narrative he had lived his entire life. Michael began to dig deeper. He searched online for former classmates, teachers, anyone who might have information about his past. What he discovered was devastating. His high school art teacher, Mrs. Patterson, was still alive. When Michael contacted her, she was shocked. "Michael, I thought you were dead. Your mother told me you'd had a nervous breakdown and that doctors had recommended complete isolation. She asked me never to contact you again." The architecture of lies began to fully reveal itself. Dorothy had systematically cut off every one of Michael's ties to the outside world. Friends, teachers, opportunities, all sabotaged with the surgical precision of someone who knew exactly what they were doing. Michael discovered he had not only been accepted into the scholarship in Italy, but also into 2 prestigious universities, a job at an art gallery in New York, and that a girl named Sarah had asked about him for years, until she finally gave up. My own mother stole my life, he whispered to himself, feeling a mix of anger and devastation he had never experienced before. Jung would call this the negative mother complex, when the maternal figure, instead of nurturing independence, devours the child's individuality to meet her own emotional needs. Michael spent 3 days processing the discovery. 3 days looking at Dorothy in a completely different way. She was no longer the devoted mother who sacrificed everything for him. She was the woman who had sacrificed him to feed her own needs. "Mom, we need to talk," he said one Thursday night while they ate dinner in silence. "Of course, dear, about what?" "About the letters, about Mrs. Patterson, about Sarah, about the entire life you hid from me." Dorothy was silent for a long time. Michael could see the panic in her eyes, the panic of someone whose carefully constructed system was crumbling. "Michael, I only wanted to protect you. The world is a terrible place, and you've always been so sensitive, so fragile." "Fragile?" For the first time in 38 years, Michael raised his voice. "Or did you make me believe I was fragile because it was easier to control me?" The mask finally fell completely. Dorothy began to cry, but they weren't tears of remorse. They were tears of desperation from someone losing the only meaning in her life. "If you leave me, I'll die, Michael. I have nothing left. You're all I have." Jung said that individuation, the process of becoming who we truly are, is the most important and most difficult journey of human life. Michael was finally starting that journey at 38, but the emotional cost was devastating. "You turned me into your emotional hostage," he said with a clarity that surprised them both. "You don't love me, Mom. You own me." Dorothy tried every strategy that had worked for decades. Tears, guilt, manipulation, threats of suicide, pretending to be ill. But something had changed in Michael. For the first time, he was seeing through the tactics. "I lost 20 years of my life, Mom. 20 years. I could have been an artist, I could have traveled, loved someone, become a father. You stole that from me." Joseph Campbell spoke of the hero's journey, the universal archetype of transformation. Michael was finally beginning his journey, but the dragon he had to face wasn't on a distant mountain. It was sitting at the dinner table wearing a floral apron. He began to make small but significant decisions. He left the house alone for the first time in years, just to walk around the block, but it was a monumental act of rebellion. Dorothy went into full panic, calling the police, saying her mentally unstable son had disappeared. "I'm not going to be your prisoner anymore," Michael said when he returned home. "And you're no longer the warden of my prison." He started applying for jobs despite having no work experience. He began learning to drive at 38. He started imagining a future, something that had been forbidden for decades. Dorothy fought every change as if her life depended on it, because in her mind it did. She had built her entire identity around being the indispensable mother of a dependent son. "You're destroying our family," she cried every night. "I'm building my life," he replied, learning for the first time the difference between guilt and responsibility. Jung believed that true psychological birth happens when we separate from the maternal Ouroboros, the symbiotic state with the mother that, if prolonged beyond necessity, becomes a form of psychological death. Michael was literally being reborn at 38. Every small independent decision was like learning to breathe again. He got a part-time job at an art supply store. It wasn't the dream scholarship in Florence, but it was his choice. For the first time in decades, he started painting again. His first pieces were dark, filled with images of cages, chains, trapped birds. But gradually, open windows began to appear, horizons, figures walking toward the light. Dorothy tried one last desperate strategy. She faked a heart attack when Michael said he was considering renting an apartment. But this time, instead of canceling his plans, he called an ambulance and accompanied her to the hospital, where the doctors confirmed she was physically fine. Psychoanalyst Wilfred Bion said that truth is the only food for the mind, but sometimes it's so harsh we prefer psychological starvation. Michael was finally feeding himself the truth, and it hurt terribly. He discovered that Dorothy had done the same thing to her own father, kept him dependent on her until his death. It was a generational pattern of pathological codependency that had destroyed at least 2 lives before his. "Mom, you're not a monster," he said in a final conversation. "You're a deeply wounded woman who turned love into a prison because you didn't know you were worthy of love, without having to imprison someone to get it." Dorothy finally broke completely. Not the manipulative breakdown she had used for years, but a genuine one. The collapse of a psychological structure that had been held up for decades through denial. I don't know who I am without you depending on me, she finally admitted. Then maybe it's time for you to find out, Michael replied, with a compassion that surprised them both. And maybe it's time for me to find out who I am without depending on you. It was the first honest conversation they'd had in 38 years. Jung said that the goal of life isn't happiness but individuation, becoming who we truly are. At 39, Michael was finally becoming Michael. He rented a small apartment 2 blocks from home, close enough to help Dorothy when needed, far enough to breathe. He started therapy, both individual and family. Dorothy, initially resistant, also began her own healing journey. Michael re-enrolled in art courses. It wasn't too late. In fact, his art now had a depth that only comes from pain, transformed into wisdom. He began dating for the first time at 39, stumbling like a teenager, but with the determination of someone who knows the value of authenticity. Sarah, the girl who had asked about him years ago, was now married, but they became friends. I always knew there was something special about you, Michael. I'm glad you finally found it. Dorothy struggled with the change but slowly started building a life of her own. She joined support groups for codependent mothers, made new friends, and even began dating again at 63. I thought loving you meant keeping you, she said to Michael during a Sunday dinner. Now I'm learning that loving means letting go. Michael looked at his mother, really looked, and for the first time saw not the warden of his prison but a wounded woman who had learned a toxic model of love and perpetuated it without realizing. We're both learning to love for real, Mom. For the first time. 2 years later, Michael opened his first art exhibition. The theme was Open Cages, paintings that depicted the journey of psychological liberation. Dorothy sat in the front row, crying with genuine pride. One of the most powerful paintings showed an open door with 2 figures, one walking out, the other learning to stand alone. Beneath it, a plaque read, "True love teaches you to fly. It doesn't clip your wings." Michael still lived alone, still learning to navigate relationships, still had hard days. But for the first time in his life, he was living his life, not the life someone else had chosen for him. He began giving talks on family codependency and late individuation. His story touched thousands of people who recognized themselves in the emotional cages others had built for them, or that they had built for others. It's never too late to be born into who you truly are, he would say, and it's never too late to love in a way that sets someone free, not keeps them trapped.